Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, MTSS Foundation, Foundational Components. This is session 1 of a four-part series, and you can find the other registration links on our website. Our presenters today are Dr. Doug Maraffa, our Pearson Global Product Advocate, and Dr. Adam Bauserman, our Pearson Senior Client Program Manager. This webinar is being presented in broadcast audio. Please turn up your computer speakers to hear the audio. There is no telephone access today. If you are having any connectivity or audio issues, please click on the question mark at the top right-hand side of your computer screen for assistance. Please type any questions you have into the chat box. The webinar handout is available under the chat box on your computer screen. Click on event resources, and you'll be able to download it from there. You will be able to access the recording of this webinar 1/2 hour after the conclusion using the login you used for the webinar today. With all that being said, I'll turn it over to Dr. Maraffa.
Well, welcome everyone, whether you're watching this live, so thank you guys for being here, or whether you're watching the recording at a later time, welcome as well. We wanted to start off with a little bit of a BG, staying alive, because it seems like this 2020 has not ended. Obviously, lots of stress for everyone around. I can't imagine another year. I'm sure there's, people that have had more stressful years, but as far as globally, this has just been an incredible year for all educators and such. We wanted to really kind of talk about, it will get better. It won't last forever. And we know that we're here to support you guys as far as, trying to support our students. We know that's a monumental task. So we really appreciate Dr. Bauserman and I for attending. We're both going to be presenting today. So you'll hear me, you'll hear Dr. Bauserman. We'll just kind of toggle back and forth and so on. As Sherry said, this is a 4-part series. We really want to take you guys through. We did this last year. It received well. We want to really lay the foundation today, talk about the components, talk about what needs to be in place for the districts, so that we can actually start building or improving, or however you guys want to look at it, and really looking at how do we look at MTSS, these multi-tier systems of support. Obviously, we're focusing on the whole child. We're looking at each individual student. How do we support their individual needs? How do we apply really strong research-based, evidence-based strategies for those needs, and so on and so forth. So we want to be able to address that and so on. Dr. Bauserman, anything in the beginning?
Nope, just wanted to welcome everybody here, and those that may be watching later. We're excited for you to be here, and I think this is going to be a really good series. So we appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Dr. Bauserman. So I think our focus, I always like to start off with the focus, really looking at why we're here. And so the idea that, we're talking about this whole child. And I think a lot of times we hear conversations about, we want to make sure we have equal access. Dr. Bauserman and I really want to talk about more about equitable access. We know that, we want everything to be equal, but yet when we go through this process, especially if you really adopt the multi-tier systems of support philosophy, you realize that we can't be all equal because our student needs are not equal. So we really want to focus on how do we target those individual strategies that allow our students to be successful. And I would really venture to say is that for you guys to really pause and say, how do we do this at the district level? How do we do it at the school level? How do I do it at the classroom level? Whether your district's not doing this or not, it's really just being able to identify, Doug, what's going on? What's going on with my kids? Some of my kids need more than others. I need to identify who those kids are so that I can apply the appropriate strategy. And we're also going to talk this series about not just the appropriate strategy, but the appropriate duration of that strategy, the appropriate intensity of that strategy, the appropriate frequency of that strategy, because we can change those duration, intensity, and frequencies based on what the students need and so on. Sometimes kids just need reminders. Kids need private conferences, and sometimes kids need a reward, some kind of positive consequence. So again, we're going to really talk about this systematically, how you guys can work through it, and so on and so forth. Okay, and like I said, we will use this PowerPoint. You guys will get this PowerPoint, but a lot of what we're going to expand on is going to be in sessions 2 and 3. Okay, cool. All right, so this is where we're going to start, and I don't want you guys to have to internalize any of this yet. This is just going to be our advanced organizer. This is the framework. This is going to be our context that we use. So again, don't have to say, well, there's lots of colors, there's lots of parts. Obviously, these are all moving parts, but this is that systematic process that we're going to eventually, by the end of session 3, you guys are going to be able to internalize. And I think the caveat to all of this is understanding that it needs to be unique to your situation. So I think a lot of times we will go on webinars or PowerPoints or have an expert come in and say, this is exactly what you have to do. So Dr. Bauserman and I do a lot of these different kinds of webinars. And what we try to do is say, let's present, what you guys need. And then what it looks like is really going to depend on your unique community of learners. So, but we want to make sure that this is something that we need to make sure that we do. So as you look at this, there's a lot of talk out there about, is it MTSS? Is it RTI? Is it PBIS? And so on. So multi-tier systems of support is the umbrella. So a lot of that term is used, that this is that big umbrella. And then all of our RTI, our tier levels models, fall under that. So I know you guys, we've had this academic RTI, especially for reading and math, for years. How do we get kids to respond? And if they don't respond, then we move them up the chain. And obviously that was actually developed for students in special education in mind. So again, just pausing and saying, do we have that kind of structure? Do we have an RTI for behavior, which we're going to use as the foundation for PBIS? Do we have an RTI for social emotional? And do we have any kind of SEL foundation that we're using for that? So we're really going to focus on those, and we'll talk a little more about that in a second. And again, the other one is that we've got to be really good at being able to identify where our kids are at. And especially the tiered level. I hear a lot when Dr. Bauserman and I really kind of go out throughout the districts or schools or get called in to consult. People want to say, well, yeah, my child or students are struggling with blank. And then we ask them, well, is that something you need to intervene with? Is it something that really, if you just apply this strategy, it kind of work its way through? So what we asked is really emphasize, how do we identify the tiered level of needs? Is this something that can be remedied by something simple? So, and the only way we know that is if we understand the scope of that need. And that's what we're going to talk about in session 2. We're going to talk about, how do we identify those problems? How do we analyze it so we understand the scope of it? And that way it's going to be easier for us to say, this is where Doug is at, this is where Adam is at, this is where Juan is at, this is where, Latricia is at. Now that we know where they're at, then we can apply those interventions. And again, on session 3, we're really going to talk about those evidence-based, research-based interventions that we need to draw from. There's so much research out there that talks about, kids that might be struggling in reading, and maybe we break it down and understand the scope, and it might be something that we do for, context clues. And so once we've identified that, so then what we do, same thing about behavior and social emotional. Obviously, Dr. Bauserman and I, if you don't know, is our uniqueness is really about the behavior and social emotional. That's really where the focus is going to be in MTSS, although we know how, obviously academic and instruction is so important. They all, flow within each other, but we're going to talk about mostly about behavior and social emotional. But again, what interventions do we apply? And then here's the kicker. It's amazing the conversations we have at districts and schools where they say, yeah, we've adopted this behavioral program. Oh, this is the best program we've seen. This is really new. It's fresh. And then they'll implement, and then we'll ask that question of, are you using the program? Oh, yeah, we're using that program. Well, what are the results? Well, we're really using that program, and then we say, well, what specifically, how do you understand the efficacy of that program? Are you tracking it? Are you monitoring those interventions? How do you know that your new adopted, spent a lot of money on programs are working? So if we want the MTSS system to actually be a system, then we've got to have a process and being able to monitor those interventions and to be able to say with confidence, yes, these are working. And if they are, we're going to continue to use them. And if they don't work with our community of learners, then we need to move somewhere else. And in hopes of that, the ultimate outcome is equity. Equitable practice is being able not just identify what's going on, but to say is I'm going to apply these evidence-based or these research-based strategies for those students because that's what they need in order to get the apple off the tree. Not everyone's going to get a math chart to help with math. Well, not everybody it just needs a math chart. Some people need more manipulatives. We need to provide equitable practice in order for all kids to be successful. And some kids don't need very much, and some kids need a lot. And we're not going to be able to just guess what that is. We're going to have to really identify and so on and so forth. And then ultimately, we're moving to positive student outcomes and a strong teacher efficacy. And the reason why is we want to be able to get really good at the data decision making, which we know is going to be accomplished through data collection and data analysis. So Dr. Bauserman and I are going to go through that process in sessions 2 and 3 to talk about specifics about what we think matters and so on. But again, positive student outcomes, that's what's going to drive what we do. And so we got to figure out how do we measure that? And then a strong teacher self-efficacy, not just efficacy in general, but a self-efficacy in math, in reading, in behavior, and social emotional learning development. We've got to be able to establish that. So that's why we want to make sure that we're emphasizing the components. Dr. Bauserman, anything on that?
Yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about, as you see the visual, it looks like they may live in isolation, academic, behavior, social, emotional. That's just for the visual so you can see the aspects that we're looking at. Got to realize many of those things are intertwined. And so if you're working on a social, emotional concern that you have, it may be intertwined in making the behavior go the way it goes and then impacting the academic. So you're thinking about interventions, they could be, we're doing it just for one focus, but it's intertwined because their behaviors are impacting everything else. So don't think about this as all living in isolation. It just helps to have a path going forward, but they can overlap and intertwine with each other as you start moving down. And so really what, as Dr. Maraffa was saying, is if with teacher efficacy and they're doing things, with validity and doing things the right way, you'll get those positive student outcomes. And it may be that you got something that was ancillary, an academic outcome, when you really thought your focus was social emotional. So just know that all these are really intertwined.
Yeah, that's a good point. And really understanding, what's amazing now with COVID, with the civil unrest, with so much going on with tropical storms and fires, just all over, globally, whether you're on the call from Canada, whether you're on the call from the States, or even, some of our friends in India and Mexico. It's this anxiety. It is amazing how much this anxiety and stress has impacted how kids feel about themselves and how they feel about school, which is manifested through very different kinds of behaviors. I know I've talked to teachers that say, my kids are very inattentive on Zoom meetings. Well, that's not surprising. The more they're anxious they feel, the more inattentive they're going to be and the more withdrawn they're going to be. So you can imagine that this time is that, like Dr. Bauserman said, it's amazing what this stress is doing at the emotional level, which is driving the manifestation of behavior, which is obviously impacting the behavior. So one of the things that we want to do, and we're not going to talk about this session, this is what we're going to talk about in session 4. We want to be able to do some kind of evaluation. We want to check for the fidelity when we look at, does this work? So don't internalize this now. It's not something we're going to pass out now, but it's where we're headed. Again, a little bit of advanced organizer about, the pieces that we need to put in and so on. We're going to talk more about the details in sessions 2 and 3. But we want to know is that obviously we want to get to a point where we can say, hey, Doug, hey, Adam, I think this is working. These are the pieces that we probably need to just keep. These are the pieces that we probably just need to remove, or these are the pieces that we probably just need to modify. And how we're going to do that is through this webinar process. So today we're laying the foundation. We're trying to get, if you walk away with, this is a systematic process. MTSS is a problem-solving model. How do we deal with the issues, whether it's global, school-wide, classroom, it doesn't matter. How do we deal with those particular problems? And then how do we make good database decisions? That's where we want to lay the foundation, and so that we can, in sessions 2 and 3, talk about specifically identifying problems and then the scope, and then being able to intervene with evidence-based, research-based practices. And then, of course, going back to the document I just showed you, how do we evaluate? So that's going to be the process for us. That's where we want to go and so on. And in order to do that, we're going to want to make sure that we have the components. So this is where we're really going to need to expand in sessions 2 and 3. But to lay the foundation, you'll notice what's first: leadership. And I think just being able to travel, mostly North America, Canada, Mexico, United States, it's amazing the impact a good leader has on a district, but more specifically a school. None of this is going to work without strong leadership. And that means, and what we hear from our teachers is the way to look at, to tell if leadership is strong, is just to ask the teachers and say, are you supported? And when the teachers say, I feel very supported by my leadership, then you can check that box. You can say, yep, that's where we are. But if you are hearing teachers at schools or districts that say, I don't feel supported at all, then there's really not going to be much, any kind of systematic process that's going to be successful. So again, pause, make sure that there is some kind of leadership. People are driving what they need to drive with the MTSS, or if and identify those people that are going to drive the SEL component, the behavioral component, the academic component, bringing all those people together under a really, really solid leader. Adam, I know you talked a lot about leadership. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I hear a lot of the same things. You'll hear people that are in the trenches that are stating we are having difficulties. We have so many students that we just don't know what to do with, and they're trying to move up, through the ranks to try to get a focus. And that's kind of what we're going to be driving here is you have to have that foundation of leadership is really invested, and this is how we're going to move forward so they can provide you the resources and the supports you need so you can provide them as a teacher or, interventionist or someone like that, down all the way to the students or clusters of students or classrooms, whichever way you're moving. So yeah, you're really going to have leadership focused and hone in on this and supporting you as you go, because if not, you're kind of going to be out there on your own little life raft trying to do whatever you can. And we know a lot of teachers are doing the best they can with what they have. You're going to have some strong leadership behind it.
Well, it's been interesting to hear teachers who, and really parents and students who talk that during this stressful time that is unprecedented, about the strong leadership that says we're going to build a structure because it has never been more important now when you've got all these moving parts. I'm looking at some of the chats and talking about how the difficulties that the secondary schools are having because there are so many moving parts, that this is where the structure needs to happen. Parents need to feel that the schools are delivering something within this unprecedented time that makes sense. Teachers want to feel like they're being supported and feeling like, oh yeah, I feel empowered to work through this. I'm not given instructions the day before on some kind of online technology. And students just want to know, am I going to be with my friends? Am I going to have a teacher that's going to teach me? So again, it's never been more important to build some kind of multi-tier systems of support structure. But again, it's got to start from that leadership. And then, of course, we're going to be really emphasizing those multi-tiered that we'll talk about in a second, but really understanding what kind of prevention measures do we have in place. We need a core curriculum for academics. We need quality evidence-based strategies when we deliver our core curriculum. We need to be able to say we have a core curriculum for our behavioral expectations. Do we have some common expectations that the district says are important, that the school says is important, that the teacher says is important? And do we have a social emotional core curriculum that really teaches kids, those many things, but the five, I call them the big five, that Castle recommends, where we're talking about being able to be self-aware, socially aware, relationship building, self-management, decision-making. Those big five, they're meaningful. And are we doing that? Otherwise, we're just going to put out a lot of fires. So we need to put in those prevention measures. Same thing about proactive. Proactive is different. It's when we start being active. So yes, we got this beautiful core curriculum, but how do we know that our kids are all going to really respond to that? So why not screen? Where are our kids at academically? Where are our kids at behaviorally? And where are they at socio-emotionally? So we've got to screen. And then once we do, now we're starting to understand what goes on. And we'll talk about that in session 2. But again, that's going to lead to some of our kids are going to need that tier 2 targeted assessment. So again, being proactive. And then, of course, the overwhelming research on the impact that relationship building has for teachers and teachers and students, teachers and parents, teachers and administration, how important that is. So again, are we doing that? And then, of course, high expectations has a huge impact on how we're able to deliver those core curriculums. Do we have teachers that are lowering expectations for our students at the margins? Again, those are the things that we've got to put in place and so on. And then we have our interactive. Are we being able to deliver the targeted instruction, small group, whether it's academic, behavior, or social emotional? Do we have that in place? Do we have a way to support these guys individually, and so on? And so then what we've got to do, what we've got on the margin is, do you guys have a process to build capacity in your district and school? And what Dr. Bauserman and I are really about is about being able to differentiate the professional development that we do, that we recommend all the time for our teachers to students. But our principals seem to forget that sometimes. Administrators forget that we've got master teachers in our buildings. They don't need to go through the same training as everybody else. They just need access to good materials. I remember going through my doctoral work I was so impressed with, I just needed access to really good research. And I needed help with that. I didn't need someone to sit down and go step by step. Well, so what we recommend is really trying to differentiate your capacity building at the campus level. Sometimes teachers need just to have access to resources. Some need direct instruction, where they're having a face-to-face interaction or maybe a Zoom call. And then some actually need coaching. They need an ongoing support in order for them to be successful. So we recommend you guys looking at that, evaluating your capacity to build, and so on and so forth. Also, community building, again, the emphasis on reaching out to the community, specifically parents. How often are we communicating? I know, again, in this unprecedented time, a lot of parents are struggling with, we just don't know. We don't know what's going on. So we want to enhance that communication. If we're going to build support structures, then we've got to be able to say that we've built a process to get that information to our parents. So how often are we doing that? Where is that? Hey, Doug, we put it on the website. Yeah, are parents reading it? We don't know, but we put it on the website. It's their responsibility to read it. Well, you're right, but a lot of parents are overwhelmed. So again, we need to have a variety of ways to be able to communicate what we're doing and to collaborate. We want those parents, the ones that have the time, to collaborate with us. So what are we doing in those kinds of things? And then the last two, again, as we said, a problem-solving process. There are so many different ones out there. They're called so many different things. What Dr. Bauserman and I want is say, just make sure that you have a process where you're identifying those needs, you're analyzing those needs, you're implementing evidence-based, research-based strategies, you're checking for fidelity, and then you're evaluating each year on whether we want to move forward, modify, delete, add, whatever. And then, of course, the database decision-making process of being able to say, what are we going to collect and what are we going to analyze and how are we going to interpret those things? So again, those are the components. That's what we're going to be emphasizing throughout, and so on and so forth. Dr. Bauserman?
Yeah, and I would say probably the bottom two boxes, the last two that Dr. Maraffa talked about, is where we find districts having the most difficulty. So they're trying to data collect, and there's a lot going on, especially if you're doing it in all three of the arenas that we talked about. You have all this, and then we have it, but then what does it tell us? And so that's a lot of work that we do. We talk with districts. Let's kind of break down the analytics, and then we can move into, we have this problem. We collected this data, but sometimes even before you get there, are you collecting the right data? And so you have to really kind of think that, you synthesize and understand the data that you're collecting will actually kind of give you information on how to implement a solution in an evaluation. Evaluation is really big at the end. You just really want to make sure what's going on. But those bottom two boxes can be very difficult. Yeah. So we hopefully, some of the things that we're going to give you throughout this series will help you work your way through there. One thing I want to tell people is, data collection is one thing, and then identifying the problem, and we don't want to stop there. And I see a lot of districts that I work with that's where they are. They have identified the problem, and then they don't know what to do from there. So really kind of hone in on those next three bullets under the problem-solving process.
So what we'll do first is really look at, and you can't see it, I apologize, but some of the text I just noticed are in a different color, so you're not seeing this, and I'll just kind of explain it to you. This is really nothing you guys have not seen before. I just wanted to make sure that we're emphasizing that in order for MTSS to work, we have to have elements for all three of our academic behavior SEL. So they're going to look different. And when we talk about the bottom, we talk about a core curriculum for academics. We talk about a core PBIS foundation, and we talk about a core SEL curriculum. When we talk about the middle, we're talking about targeted small groups that we're dealing with behavior issues that are impacting the classroom, or we're talking about social emotional skills deficits that kids have that we need to target. So again, that's kind of what we want to look at. But I think the more important one are the next two, and we've kind of alluded to this, is that when we talk about this identification, and again, we're going to talk a lot more in depth about this in 3, we're talking about screening. We need to know which kids are at risk. And I'll tell you, what we've seen a lot of in our districts across North America is, hey, Doug, we're in a Zoom-like online, virtual world. How do we do this? And say, so a lot of our districts that would normally have teachers screen kids, they might say the teachers are answering questions on students. Now we're seeing a shift this year from students doing self-reporting. How do they feel about certain things? And then we're having parents screen on kids. That information is becoming vital because teachers, again, might not know kids in the beginning. But again, if teachers are doing Zoom meetings and they can still be able to understand kind of where kids are at, what they're struggling with, a student who withdraws in the classroom, could very well withdraw from the Zoom. They're off task, they're not chatting, they're making fun of people, they're talking over people. Dr. Bauserman and I have been getting a lot of teachers. We talk about webinars that we do, and I say, well, all the behaviors, how do I track behaviors on Zoom? Well, a lot of times they're the same behaviors. They just might look a little different. And so again, we had one teacher who we were talking through, and she was like, well, what kinds of behaviors should I see? And we say, well, what are your expectations? Everything that you expect in the classroom, you need to be really explicit about what you expect on a Zoom call. But again, those kinds of behaviors, those kinds of emotions, we need to identify those as quickly as possible. So if you're looking at screening, you might want to wait till teachers know students, whether that's virtual or whether they're starting to come back to class. Some of our districts across the North America, they're not ever going to go back to class until the end of May. So again, being able to figure out virtually or online what those kids are experiencing, we can still do those screening measures. And then the same thing about assessment. We have at the very end of this PowerPoint, our telepractice recommendations for those people in Canada, for those people in the United States. You will be able to access some telepractice resources that will allow you to do some deeper assessments, so that, again, we want to be able to really identify those targets, those deficits, so that you guys obviously can start building that tier level tree. And again, I've seen this work really well, where some people are like, Doug, we do it really well with academics. We do benchmarking. We have our state accountability test that some people use, and we break them down, and we do these benchmarks every 6 weeks. And then I'll say, well, what are you doing with behavior? Well, we really don't all we look is office referrals. Well, office referral doesn't tell us the picture. That's not necessarily screening. We want to identify in the beginning those kids that might be on a difficult path, a challenging path, and so on. Same with social emotional. It is even more critical to identify those kids who have a self-awareness, that have empathy, that are able to self-regulate, and the ones that have a risk of not being able to do it. We need to really identify that. And like I said, being able to tag on to those tier 2 and those tier 3 with some kind of assessment measures, finding out what we can do to find the scope of what's going on for kids. We want to be able to do our target deficits, because remember, being able to target the deficit is going to make it so much easier to intervene. Dr. Bauserman, anything on identifying need?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're having a lot of districts right now that are screening with students reporting it, trying to get parents to report, using some teacher reporting, as Dr. Maraffa said, through the Zooms and what they're seeing or what they're hearing. But they're using it to plan a lot of their tier 1 support for when the students do arrive. So they may be finding through a screening process they have a lot of kids with anxiety, which I imagine we are, or they're having, some type of depression or any other type of issue that's going on caused by, the civil unrest or the COVID. There's lots of things going on, but they want to get ready and support those students, not and move them into tier 2 and move them up into tier 3. They want to do that because they're probably going to have a lot more students at those having those concerns. And so they're starting to build their PBIS supports, their MTSS supports, all of their tier 1 level stuff for that, mass of students that's coming in. So we can address that almost, classroom wide versus, trying to go all the way down to a targeted student. So there's a lot of prep work being used through this problem identification for sure.
And I think Paula has a great question. A lot of these screening are normed, and we have norm data that are dependent on, I think one of the best three that we use might be normed on 32 different states, 115 schools, thousands of children. So how do you take that norm data that was normed in a very traditional way and then apply it to a virtual? Well, one of the things I think we have to do is be able to have a little bit of a latitude on what we identify, because one of the questions on the best three is, I worry. It's very simple. And so again, being able to say, yes, I worry at a 3, a 4, mostly, not mostly, that's still going to apply. That's still significant data that we can do something with, and so on and so forth. And I'm sure that the authors of these screeners are very sensitive to the fact that we've normed in a traditional setting, but now we're asking kids to apply that in a different setting. But I still think, Paula, that's a great question. I don't think it's going to be 100% where we could say, oh, we feel great about it. But I do think it's enough where we're going to get the benefit of being able to screen those, so that we can identify. Because remember, the screening measures are trying to capture, we're not diagnosing, we're screening. And those can be powerful in being able to identify those kids at risk. Now, we're assessment. That's why we want to emphasize the telepractice process, because with assessment, when we are looking at diagnosis, target deficits, that's going to be quite different on how we go through that assessment process. That does have to maintain but the screening, I would highly recommend you guys looking for screeners, and being able to use those via whether you've got kids virtually or not, or so on. And then, which leads to our tier level interventions. Again, this is going to be mainly session 3. We're going to expand this idea that, districts are able to provide an array of evidence-based strategies, research-based strategies. And again, I have found, and I'll let Dr. Bauserman speak to his experience, but I have found that it's really not districts or schools that don't have the intervention measures. I think the difficulty becomes, one is what measures or what interventions are actually the ones that have a strong efficacy, a strong result, great student outcomes. And that's the one we need to use, because I think a lot of schools and districts will invest in several different ones in hopes that something works, instead of trying to implement with fidelity 2 or 3 and really getting the benefit of the full pure program. So again, but we need to make sure we have an array. The array is, what do we do for those tier 1? We don't just leave tier 1 kids alone. Tier 1s need to be validated. Tier 2s, we're going to target. Tier 3, we're going to provide some kind of individual interventions. But do we have access to those? Do our teachers have access to those? So again, how are we delivering those kinds of things to our teachers? I know that one of the things that Dr. Bauserman and I work with is Review 360 software, behavioral software. And one of the things that we tried to do in that when we were helping develop it was not to have 8,000 different strategies. So we always recommend to districts is help your teachers identify those powerful top 30, top 20, top 10 that really, based on the research and evidence-based information, that really work. And how do we get those in the hands of teachers? They're not going to read a book. They're not going to process on their own. They don't have time. So how do we deliver that? That's going to be our recommendation. And then, of course, the progress monitoring is, how do we know that these interventions are working? How do we know that we have a strong core curriculum in academics? How do we know that our targeted group work is working? How do we know that our behavioral program, Love and Logic, Capturing Kids' Hearts, Restorative Practice, are they working? And are teachers using them? We saw this movement at Johnson Middle School that kids were actually starting to move into a positive direction. But we want to know is what specific strategies are working. Same with social emotional. If I'm going to use some kind of social emotional learning curriculum, let's break down the strategies. My wife is a fourth grade teacher, and she talks a lot about for her kids to be able to self-monitor. So one of the things I worked on with her was the barometer check. Being able to say I'm a 0 to 5, or I'm a 5 to 10, or 6 to 10. That's just a very rudimentary way to say, hey, I'm not feeling well. But that's a skill set. And what we've got to do is to teach teachers, here are the interventions that you can work. We're not just doing social skills development on Monday from 8 to 8:15 and then we leave it alone. This has got to be an integral part of what we do. And the only way you guys are going to know if it's an integral part is if you're monitoring those interventions. We want to know what are you using and is it working? And if we can't, then how do we know we're going to have to build on that? So again, we're going to be looking at student progress to see if, again, we're making those movements and so on. So again, our recommendation, and I'll let Dr. Bauserman talk more about this, is don't try to do too much. Try to do 2 or 3 things really well before you start throwing everything in the kitchen sink. Dr. Bauserman?
Yeah, I agree 100%. It's difficult at times in working in behavior or any other arenas and seeing they have 32 strategies they're trying to implement. And so if the student is making progress, you don't even know which one worked because you've had so many things going on. But I think to the bigger point of what Dr. Maraffa was saying is it's a skill set as well. You probably have access to many of these evidence-based interventions and progress monitoring strategies, but the skill sets of the teachers may not align with those. And it goes back to what Dr. Maraffa said earlier, is it may be that you have teachers that just need access to them and they'll be fine. They've been around or they've gone through some type of, training for either through data collection or behavior management or things like that. And then you have others that you really need to take a direct approach, hands-on, get them, understanding how to do it. And then others that you may do that and then continue with coaching. Because it really is a skill. Nothing against the teacher. I was a first-year general ed teacher many years ago, and you wouldn't have those skill sets. You just don't learn them through any preparatory work, and so it's just kind of an acquired thing that you have to work on. So I think that's going to be a big focus, that the stuff is there, the curriculums, the materials. It's can the people that are there actually use it? And so that's kind of a focus you need to make sure when we're talking about this section. Absolutely.
Yep. Which leads to back where we started. So our recommendation is, again, Dr. Bauserman and I are behavioral people. We've been dealing with behavior for the last 30 years, and some great questions on the chat, about the theoretical foundations by which we, promote these things, things like ABA, applied behavior analysis, where we know work really well with students with autism and so on, is what we try to do is we try to say, look, PBIS has been recommended since 1995. The tenets of being proactive, preventative, and positive, they work. But we also know that you've got to make it unique to your community of learners. And what we recommend you guys do from now and until our next session is because, what I'd be asking myself is, what screeners can I use? What strategies can I use? What curriculums can I use? And that's what we want you guys to start asking. So our recommendation is to look at this graphic that we created and to say, and to start populating that, yes, Doug and Adam, I feel good about this section. I feel like we've got some core academic things in place. We've got some core ways to identify kids academically. We've got some core ways to intervene for kids academically. But what we're missing is blank. If you bring all those blanks to our next session, we're going to start talking about how specific tools that you can use in order to identify. So we're going to be working on session 3 this screening, this assessment, what tools can we use? Again, have more conversations about what other districts and schools have done to identify their problems of practice, and then their problem analysis to be able to really identify, is this a tier 1, is this a tier 2, or is this a tier 3? Do we need to intervene? Do we need to leave it alone? Do we need to let it work out by itself? That's what we're going to be focused on with this tier. And then Adam and I are going to be sharing those evidence-based strategies. Those things that we know in the last 30 years, we have heard people say have been very successful. Both Adam and I we work with students with emotional disturbance. We dealt with very intense and chronic and severe behavior. We've coached. We've worked at the state level. So again, we want to share all that experience, how we've seen the interventions. But we also too is, if you guys are going to participate in session 2 and 3, we would highly recommend you to keep offering your experience through the chats. Tell us what has worked well for you guys, because we obviously want to share that with everybody on the call, whether they're live or you're doing other things. So again, that's what we're going to, hopefully by the end of session 3, you guys feel better equipped. Obviously, you're not going to feel completely, because it takes a lot to do this, but hopefully we can answer or provide some support for some of your gaps in these kinds of components that we need to put together. And then, of course, we're going to do that through October 14th is going to be our next session on webinar 2. And then we're going to have our third session on the 13th. So hopefully, by the 13th, at least you have a blueprint. At least you have a map, a pathway to say, Doug, you know what? Some of you guys are going to say, I feel really good about, where we are. I feel like my school or my district or whoever, I feel like we're on the right path. Some of you guys are going to like, wow, I didn't realize, how many pieces I think that we probably need to consider. But again, this is just things that we're piecing together from lots of different things that we have shared, that we have read, that we have researched, and so on and so forth. So hopefully you guys will be able to join us. Adam, before I open for questions, anything before questions?
No, I'm answering some questions in the Q&A. There was a question about, and I'm missing the chat because we have a chat and a Q&A, so I'm responding to that. But we'll pull up some of the Q&A questions and go through them. So I'm good.
Okay. All right. So then we're going to lead to, and just a reminder is, for the next however 5 or 10 minutes, we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. In the meantime, if you're someone that wants to get information on the U.S. side, here on whether there are additional assessments, if you need an assessment consultant, or if you want any kind of resources on telepractice, you can pull that one up. For those people in Canada, we've got some hot links that you guys can pull up. Again, if you've got those kinds of contacts, assessments, or any kind of telepractice. For Dr. Bauserman and I, here's our information, so you guys can please feel free to email us with the questions and so on. But I'm just going to leave that up there for now, and then we're going to go to the chat. Adam, you have anything burning that we can answer?
Yeah, one of them, or a couple of them, have been asking, are there some recommendations for screeners that they could do remotely? So if you want to take that one, I'm answering a few others in here directly to them. If you want to take that one, go ahead.
Yep. And so what we're looking for is the two that we promote are the BEST 3. That is a screener that you can actually have students and parents report, and that's done through a URL address link. So all you have to do is create a screener at the school district. A link will be generated, and you just send the link home to mom or dad or the student, and they can actually just pull that up on a smartphone, a tablet, desktop, put in their student ID number, and then answer the questions, and they're done. So that makes it really nice using 360 with those screeners. We also have one called the SSIS-SEL, the social skills screener. It's another fantastic screener. Again, we have ways that we can We can do self-assessments for those as well. So again, those two screeners we're going to talk more about on session 2.
So there was, you kind of alluded to it earlier, there was a question about what approach are you using to assess behavior, collect data, decide on intervention, follow up? Do you use the ABA approach?
Yeah, we recommend all of it. Samira, I think what Adam and I have learned is that, with one of the softwares, we have a thing called an FBA. It's a functional behavioral assessment tool that allows you to do different kinds of assessments and gather that information in order to understand the function of the behavior, the antecedents, the consequences of those outcomes. But, we're both big believers in ABA. Like I said, I use ABA for my students with autism. We understand that concept, that philosophy. But again, we highly recommend, finding ways to capture the behavioral story as quickly as you can. So we try to recommend different ways to do that. So yeah, great question.
Here is a really good question that came in, and now I can't find it. They keep popping, they're moving so fast. Are you finding a greater amount of significance or success within the urban versus suburban school systems? Beginning level recommendations for urban school systems are often require more supports than level or tier 1 recommendations. So kind of looking at urban versus suburban.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting from the research is looking at the connection with home. Is there's a significant difference in reaching out to kids in the urban areas with reading versus math. And so I think that's one of the things we'll talk about. Is it's not necessarily that, we've got two different populations, one's good, one's bad. I think sometimes we have some kinds of unnecessary deficits that we think, deficit thinking. What we found is that there are research-based strategies that work better in urban areas and that require maybe a different approach or maybe a different intensity that versus maybe suburban or rural or so on. So we'll talk more about that in sessions 2 and 3, but because I don't want to get into it now, it's a great conversation. I just don't want to expand on that when we can do that in session 2 and 3. But I think the walk away is we need to be better at, when I say evidence-based strategies, we need to be better at what has worked in this particular demographic area, in a rural area, when we talk about parents that maybe don't have an emphasis on education. How do we bridge them versus parents that are overly involved, parents that are in our face? Two different problems, but they're still two parent problems. So again, does our strategy really fit, with what those kids are going through and so on? So I applaud the question. I think that we'll be able to expand on it in sessions 2. Unless you have something under.
No, I think that's good. There's one that says, do these assessment screeners work for high school students? And I can talk to this one a little bit. In working with the best 3, I can say that at middle school and at high school, the student form has become invaluable. These are giving opportunities to students to really voice how they are and how they feel, because as we know, social pressures and social, inquiries from their peers. If I walk in the nurse, if I walk in the counselor, they're going to ask you, what were you doing in there? What was going on? Why did they call you down there? They don't have those pressures when they're filling this out on their own. And we're getting to see that a lot of students are telling us exactly how they feel. So that one is, that probably is my best answer to that one. We're really getting some good information for them.
Yeah, that's good.
There is another one here that will we be looking at how this is different in elementary, middle, and secondary? Yes, we will talk as we move into the next sessions of how we move forward, because there is a mindset that it's very different at elementary, very different at middle, very different at high, and I've worked at all three levels. You know, the understanding of high school, they should know this, they should be able to do this, why are we looking into this? And so that one is something we can kind of move to towards the next couple sessions. But here was one that I liked, is we're using the word behavior and using social emotional. Dr. Maraffa, I'll give you the first shot, and then I'll add my answer to it as well. But how are you distinguishing between those two? What's different when you say a behavior line versus a social emotional line?
Yeah, I think how I try to do that in my webinars, we get deep into that, is that I always say behavior is communication. So the behavior that students manifest, they're communicating how they feel. So I look at it as behavior as the manifestation of how they're feeling emotionally. So kids are trying to deal with their emotions, you know, whether it's self-regulating or so on, but it's manifesting in through a withdrawal, you know, hit, throw, profanity, you know, sleeping, you know, talking. So we like to address this. How do we minimize the behavior enough so that the kids still get academic support? But we're, like Dr. Bauserman said in the very beginning, this is it's always an integrated approach. How are we teaching them the social skills that minimizes the frequency of the behavior? How are we minimizing the impact of the actual behavior? And how are we promoting the academic structures by doing all that? So behavior is very much about communication, what's manifested. The social emotional is more about how they feel and so on and so forth. So that's kind of how I direct that. Dr. Bauserman?
Yeah, I look at it the same way. I think of behavior as the student within themselves, you know, how they are either externalizing their behaviors, they're internalizing their behaviors within their own body, within their own means. The social emotional is how are they interacting with the societal norms, with other people in society? You know, are they socially aware? Are they, you know, personally aware of what's going on? How are they making decisions? And so within the confines and the constructs of the social setting. So that's kind of how I differentiate those two. But I thought that was just an excellent question, because, you know, that could be confusing on what we're trying to convey.
And I think another good question about the BASC versus the BASC BESS, you know, don't want to get those confused. So the screener that we're talking about is the BASC 3 BESS, the behavior emotional screener system, which can be very different than just the BASC. So somebody on the chat line did a great job of making sure we make that distinction. Also, I know, Josh, we are very sensitive to MTSS and the academic. I know that because Dr. Bauserman and I are both behavioral people, that is probably the emphasis. We tried to explain that last year, but we want to touch on it. But for you, Josh, I think it's really about maybe getting what you can get from sessions 2 and 3 for academic, is really trying to understand the structures that we need to put in place. We will try to share as much as the academic strategies as we can, but it probably will be more loaded with the behavior. But we'll do our best to make sure that we're offering the academics as well. So that was a great point as well, Josh. So thank you.
So I know we're pushing up to time. I'm just scrolling through. They have.
We got one more.
They've come pretty quick. Is it recommended to give these screeners to all students or only the students with suspected SEL concerns? Jeff, I think that's a great question. You want to go first, Doug, or you want me to blast it first?
You can take that one.
I'll take this one. So, Jeff, this is a big thing that comes up with us. I hear this a lot from schools. You have to think that when we talk about screening, it's universal. It's universal. We're looking for all kids. We want to screen everybody because kids may not show, whether you're using maybe the best 3, they're not showing things externally that you are not really picking up on, and it may glean itself out from that screener. So now you have a student that, you know, may have some anxiety or is suffering from a little bit of depression, and they're wanting to convey that to you, and now they have that opportunity to do so. Same thing with SEL concerns. If you're not real Castle savvy and you have teachers that you're just trying to get information from teachers, that's how it's working, and they're not 100% sure on what they're looking for, it gives kids an opportunity as well. But you want to make sure we screen everybody, because we want to grab some kids that we may not be aware of. Kids who are external are pretty easy to see. A kid kicks, spits, fights, punches. We get all that. It's the other kids you can pick up on. So I would recommend doing it to all kids.
Thanks, Dr. Bauserman. Sherry, one quick question is, if they register for today, does that mean they're registered for the rest of the sessions, or do they have to register for each session?
They will need to go in and register for each session.
And where do they find those links? Is it on the same one that they had, or?
Right. They will be on our website, www.pearson.com.
Okay.
And I would believe, would it be MTSS?
Yeah, probably so. Okay.
Okay, perfect.
And if anybody on the call is, struggling with the registration, just reach out to Dr. Bauserman and I. We'd be happy to help with that. Thank you guys so much. So appreciate your time. I know we didn't get to all the questions. Again, we'll have an opportunity on sessions 2 and 3. But again, we really wish you guys the best. I know it's a difficult time, so we're here to support you. So let us know how we can do that. So Dr. Bauserman?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everybody that came today. There were lots of questions about this session. It is recorded. It will be sent to you. The PowerPoint that you saw will be sent to you as well. But I just want to let everybody know that I am getting close to supermodel status, like Dr. Maraffa screen showed, because of all the calories I'm losing from stress. But we're here to support, and we hope that you will come back and join us, the next couple of sessions that we do, and keep generating these questions. It really helps us kind of figure out where we want to go.
Cool. All right. Take care.